Okay, and Juan, do we need to check this connection to that? Because we remember, unfortunately, we got a mic two ways here, so the recording picks up as well. Is it picking up? Good, all right. Today what we're going to do is we're going to break apart essays in contracts and torts. And it's going to be somewhat interactive because you're going to actually read the question and pick out issues. You're not going to sit there and just write, though, because we're going to interact together. There will be a lot of substantive review as well as technique review. I like to start with contracts and torts because they're a little easier to organize than some of the other subjects, honestly. Contracts, of course, we're going to see the Florida distinctions are very, very minimal, so that helps too. But remember, as you are, a couple of things, just basic things I want to stress with you about the Florida portion and essay writing. Make sure that you are picking up those Florida distinction outlines as you go along. Don't leave them till the end. Because if you do, you may not get around to them, or then that's the only rule that you remember. Both of those are bad options. Read those Florida distinctions now. If your commercial course is assigning an essay to you in any particular subject, then don't just write before you've looked at the outline, right? You need to know some law. Think about it. You write a much better essay if you've studied the law first. And I've had some people ask, how many essays a week should I be writing? It's quality, not quantity. Do you want to practice? Of course you do. And many of you are already doing that. But if you just write essays without thinking about anything, and you write 50 essays, you can still fail the Florida portion of the exam. Same with multiple choice. You can do 5,000 multiple choice questions and still fail the MBE. So quality, not quantity. Before we jump in, many of you have sent me essays, and normally I'm right on top of it, and I'll turn it around in a day or so. This was a particularly busy week for me because I'm teaching 2 summer school classes, and I had the summer conditional program this week. So I am a little behind, but this weekend, that's going to be my main focus. So I'm going to be getting caught up. And also understand, those of you who have gotten essays back already, I give you fairly detailed critique, not just in terms of format, but also content. So it takes a while. I mean, it can take a good hour and even more than that sometimes to critique an essay. So I am going to devote my weekend to it. I will catch up, and certainly don't assume I'm not going to read. I think at this point I have at least responded to everybody. There was one that I thought I had responded to and said, yes, I got it. If any time you send an essay and I haven't fairly quickly at least said, yes, I got it, then send it to me again. But if you get a message saying, I got it, I'll get back to you as soon as I can, then it's on my list. I have a log, I have a list. I mean, it's very well organized. All right, any questions, comments before we dive into substance? Anything anybody wants to ask? Burning questions at this point? All right, so what we're going to do first is the contracts question. So what I'm going to ask you to do is take just a few minutes. It's a fairly short fact pattern. Read it, and then we're going to pick it apart. And again, we're going to look at the substance. I'm sorry. Yes, the fact pattern is at the very end. I apologize for that. It's at the very end of the contracts packet. only one, Marla. It's only one? Okay, then I got it.
Well, I'm going to send you a new one because I studied the law every day.
Okay, I haven't read it yet. Oh, you want to send it to me?
A new one.
Yeah, send me a new one. Okay. Yeah, some good stuff, actually, for which there are no answers, but it really made me think.
I put them all together in one.
Yeah, no. Okay, but some of that stuff, I went, that's interesting. No one's, and I did a little bit of research too, because off the top of my head, there are no answers, so good thinking.
So at least I'm thinking.
Yeah, no.
Oh, thanks.
I'm sorry.
Take it.
Okay, give you just a couple of moments more to kind of finish. Again, you're just reading and spotting issues at this point. All right, so let's see what we have. Now, many of you have already done, you did the Carrie and Paul and the Cakes and Things essay. And so it introduced you to the first question that you have to answer, even in a question like this one, which is pretty simple. First issue always is going to be what? Governing law. And the nice thing about contracts is that any contracts essay is going to follow the same arc, the same format. So if you walk in to the exam, if they give you contracts, and honestly, you may not have a standalone contracts essay this time, but should they give you a standalone contracts essay, it always follows the same form. And you will know going in, if I have contracts, here are the components I need to discuss. Makes it easier. It may not make it easy, but it makes it easier because you know, walking in, what your structure is going to be. And as much as possible, it's another, and why I picked the particular torts question that I did for today as well. As much as possible, if you know walking in what your structure is, you will do a better job of writing the essay. You don't want to have a canned answer. That's not particularly helpful, but a good structure is. So, in this particular question, first issue, of course, is going to be governing law. And of course, the subject matter here is, it's strawberries, and strawberries are goods. Even if it's a growing crop, right? Because 2105, you don't need section numbers, but 2105 tells you that a growing crop is considered a good. So right up at the top, you know that you need to identify your governing law. Here, you don't need to spend a lot of time on hybrid transactions or anything like that, because it isn't. It's just straight up goods. Some of you tried to spend some time on hybrid transactions with Carrie and Paul and cakes and things. I can't say it's wrong. I wouldn't put much attention to it, though, because there's a lot of case law that says that if it's a contract for the sale of a good made by the seller, but the contract is about the sale of goods, then it's Article 2, and it really isn't considered to be a hybrid or mixed transaction. And some of you, interestingly, some of you were thinking, well, they gave us two parts to the question. Carrie versus Paul, and Paul versus, was it cakes and things, whatever it was. And so one part must be Article 2 and one common law. Not necessarily. They have done that in the past. There's one I'm thinking of in particular involving a dentist who rented a building and then also bought a sculpture. The sculpture part of the contract was governed by Article 2. The building rental was governed by the common law. So can they split it up that way? Yes. But don't automatically assume that it is split up that way if you have two parts to the essay. Because the cakes and Carrie and Paul and all that stuff, both parts were Article 2 questions. This one, it's definitely Article 2. And I want to suggest you do one other thing. Should you get a common law question, which you easily could get. I see a lot of people approach a common law question by saying Article 2 applies to transactions in goods. Goods are all things movable. There's no good in this question. Don't go at it from the negative. If it's a service, say this contract is about a service, washing a car, or this contract is about a lease of real property and its land. And the common law governs the lease or any transfer of land. The common law governs services. Speak from the affirmative, not the negative. All right, so now let's go through the facts, knowing, of course, the first thing we're going to talk about is governing law, and let's pick out our issues. And this question very nicely starts where we're supposed to start, because once you've talked about governing law, where do you go next? Contract formation. You have to form the contract. And there's a lot about contract formation in this question. So we're going to stop and we're going to talk about contract formation. But if they give you a completed contract and they say signed, sealed, and delivered, right? Then don't spend a lot of time talking about offer and acceptance. Talk about the issues that the facts raise. You have 1 hour to answer the question. That's it. And so if you take all these side trips to show them all the things you learned, you'll never get around to the issues that are really raised by the facts. And while it wouldn't be wrong to have, wrong when I say wrong, incorrect, to have a lengthy discussion of the common law and what it applies to in this question, you've just wasted time, you've wasted points. So get to the point. Talk about what is raised. Don't talk about what is not raised. So, Sam operates a business growing and selling strawberries in Plant City, Florida. That first, it always, what are these facts here for? That growing and selling strawberries, it's to tell us what? That it's to tell us that Article 2 applies. And somebody said merchants. Now, it does suggest that Sam is a merchant, but I'm also going to urge you to not jump into merchant status right away. Some people may tell you, talk about it right away, but it's not necessary necessarily relevant. In this question, it's going to become relevant because we have a firm offer. But talk about merchant status where it is relevant, because Article 2 applies to all sales of goods. It's not restricted to transactions between merchants. So if I sell a bottle of water, I'm not a merchant of water. Still, Article 2 applies. When it becomes relevant for the first time in this question is the firm offer. Discuss merchant status where it's relevant. Now, Plant City. We have anybody from that area, from the Tampa area? Interesting. Usually I do. Plant City is actually relevant here. This part of this question, I think, is terribly unfair for those of us, like I came from Indiana, for people from someplace else, or even people from South Florida. I'll explain why later. But they told you Plant City for a reason. Part of it, of course, is just to say it's Florida law, but there's another reason, and we'll come back to that. To me, the unfair part of it, but it is very important to this question. On February 1st, Sam sends messages to Ann, Beth, and Carl, 3 Florida fruit dealers. Well, they are merchants, but it's not important yet. Maybe important later on. And he sends it by fax. Do we really care if he sends it by fax? Not really, but it may relate to their responses, right? Because the offeror is the master of the offer and can stipulate the method of acceptance, but if not, it's any reasonable method, and if the offer is sent by fax, then any reasonable method in responding is going to be sufficient. Each fax says, I herewith offer to sell 400 pounds of number 2 strawberries at $3 per pound. We'll hold this offer open through February 10th. Advise if you accept. Sorry, I totally forgot. I'm supposed to be micing you guys. Can you hear me in the back? No. Yes, no? Okay. And make sure you, the folks in the back, because this room, the acoustics aren't great. If you can't hear me, let me know. So, I herewith offer to sell 400 pounds of number 2 strawberries at $3 per pound. What do we see in that sentence? All sorts of good stuff, right? When you're reading the sentence, what are you supposed to be doing? You're supposed to be writing down what you see in the sentence. I herewith offer indicates that Sam has what? Intent. Because we need to demonstrate that there's an offer. If we're talking about contract formation, then we go through the elements of contract formation. Offer, acceptance, consideration. Offer first, of course, because if you don't have an offer, who cares about the rest? What does an offer need to have? It's got to have intent to make a contract. It's got, I call it definite terms. I know if you had Professor Sullivan, he calls it content, whatever you call it, the terms, right? And the offer has to be communicated to the offeree. Now, as you write your answer, analyze each separately. Don't write a bunch of block of rules followed by a bunch of facts. That's not analysis. Break it apart into little mini IRACs. So first element is intent. It's clearly present. I herewith offer. So don't write 5 pages on intent, right? Because it's real simple. To sell 400 pounds of number 2 strawberries. Why is that important? Quantity. Under Article 2, the one definite term that is essential is quantity. And it says 400 pounds of strawberries. Definite enough, I think. At $3 per pound. That's obviously, it's a price term. Is price required under Article 2? No, it's not. Remember that if you don't have price stated, it's a reasonable price, right? We have a gap filler in 2305. So I wouldn't spend a lot of time talking about price here. I point out to you just to remember as you are reviewing the material that price can be supplied by the parties later, or it can be a reasonable price. We'll hold this offer open through February 10th. It's an attempt to create what? A firm offer. Now we got to stop for a second and think about what the elements of a firm offer are. We need, first of all, the offeror must be a what? Now the offeror has to be a merchant. It's one of those 13 merchant provisions in Article 2. Now we talk about merchant status. But remember, for a firm offer, just the seller needs to be a merchant. We don't need both parties to be a merchant. Sometimes the seller has to be a merchant. Sometimes both parties have to be a merchant. Sometimes the seller has to be a particular kind of merchant. A goods merchant if we have an implied warranty of merchantability. A practices merchant if we have a statute of frauds issue. So take your time and analyze merchant when it is appropriate. And of course, we know Sam is a merchant here because he deals in goods of the kind, and he probably also holds himself out as having that skill or judgment because he's a commercial seller. And he's in the business of growing and selling strawberries. Advise if you accept signed Sam. Signed Sam because? Does an offer need a signature? No, but a firm offer does. Because a firm offer has to be in writing, made by a merchant offeror, stating it will be held open for a specific time not to exceed 3 months, and it has to be signed by the offeror. So we have all the elements of a firm offer there. As you analyze that part of the offer, you need to go element by element. And you can't really hide, can you? Because you know what the elements of a firm offer are, or you don't. And if you can spell them out and break them apart and show that each is present, that's how you maximize your points. The more specific you are in your statement of the rule, of course, if it's a relevant rule, the more points you get. And the better job you do of showing the analysis, the direct application of the law to the facts, the better your answer is, and so more points you get. So now, I'm going to stop for a moment in terms of substance and just talk about form presentation. We have an offer that's made to all three, Ann, Beth, and Carl. Now, as you're reading the question, you'll see that Ann, Beth, and Carl each respond in a different way. So you've got to make a tactical call right up front before you start to write. Am I going to analyze Sam versus Ann, Sam versus Beth, Sam versus Carl, do the full analysis for each separately, or am I going to do some group analysis? Both approaches can be appropriate. You have to decide up front, and you'll see the same thing when we get to torts. A little bit of tactic before you start to write. What did I do in this case? For efficiency's sake, because after all, it is just an hour question. So we'll go past governing law, we just did that. I look at the offer in respect to all three because the same offer was made to all three. I didn't break it apart. Where I break it apart is in the acceptance component, right? It's not wrong to do each separately. It just takes more time. So notice what I did. I go definite terms. Actually, well, the intent was on the previous page. Got to go intent first, definite terms, stressing quantity, and mentioning that there are other terms. And I'm not going to stop on each page and give you time to write it all down. You have it all in front of you, right? But as I'm going along, if there's anything that you see that you have a question about, then make sure that you ask. So I talk about the basic offer first, and then I go into the specifics of the firm offer. Because even if it's a firm offer, it still has to have those three things: intent, definite terms, and communication to the offeree. And so you can see what I'm doing. Each component, I break the rule down into components. Each component I analyze separately. Now, acceptance. Who can accept? Before we take each separately, notice that I talk about the fact that we have multiple offerees. It's a small issue here, but it's actually an issue. Because, think about it, we have the same facts sent to Ann, Beth, and Carl. Can each accept in this case? Does it say first come, first serve? No, don't say that. I have 400 strawberries. So could Ann accept? Yes. Could Beth accept? Yes. Could Carl accept? Yes. how many strawberries or bushels of strawberries does Sam have to sell now? 1,200. In this case, we have 3 offerees. And so Sam is going to have to sell 1,200 bushels if they all accept properly and if the contract is otherwise enforceable. What issue related to this, not raised by these facts, but what might you be thinking about? Well, statute of frauds is an issue. We're going to get there. But just in terms of the multiple offerees.
He only has 400 pounds.
I'm sorry?
He only has 400 pounds.
Well, if he has 400 pounds of strawberries and that's it, if he doesn't say first come, first serve, he's going to have to go out and find some strawberries. But, number one, he could say first come, first serve. Or we might be concerned if he sends out that fax to not just 3, but to 30 maybe, or 300. If he sends that fax out to a lot of different potential offerees, then it's an invitation for an offer. And I'm raising that because we're going to do a lot of substantive review here, not because it's in this question. I would not, in writing my answer, take that side trip. And understand that in our conversations, we'll talk about more than what goes in your answer so that we can do substantive review. And also understand, because people look at the packets that you get and you go, how can I write that in an hour? Sometimes you won't be able to write in an hour everything I have in an answer, and I'll tell you that straight up. The torts question would be one of them. We'll talk a little bit about tactics. What do you do when you've got a question that is clearly worthy of 2 or 3 hours? Don't ever, by the way, though, don't ever think, wow, I really know contracts, and so I'm going to spend an hour and a half on contracts, and then I'll just spend a half hour on trusts or whatever else comes along. Bad idea. 1 hour per question. In law school, if I have a multiple essay exam, and a student does really well in the first essay and then runs out of time on the second, I might adjust the grading because I could see a good job was done. Doesn't happen on the bar exam. Each question is graded by a different grader. They don't care what you did on the other questions. They care only about what's in front of them. So 1 hour per question. Now, again, with the multiple offerees, I would at least mention the fact that we have multiple offerees and that it probably means in this question that Sam has to come up with 1,200 bushels of strawberries if they all 3 accept. All right, now notice what I do. Question? Yes, Jim? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, why is that?
Why is what? I'm sorry.
You said even though it's multiple offerees,
oh, yeah,
because
well, it's 3 offerees. Does the offer say anything about to whom it's limited, first come, first serve, anything like that? Nope. And so if an offer is sent out to an offeree, communicated to the offeree, right? Can the offeree accept? Yes. And if we have multiple offerees, they can all accept if they follow the instructions in the offer. Right? Okay, so now I'm going to break it apart because Ann did one thing. Beth did something else. Carl did something else. So now I've got to deal with them separately. And you can see with Ann, if we look at what she did, going back to the facts, Ann sends the following facts. Sam, I shall take 400 pounds of number 2 strawberries at $3 per pound per your, it should say offer. I just noticed there's a typo there. That's an acceptance, right? Because it mirrors. But then she says, I expect delivery within 10 days. Signed, Ann. Oops, we have an additional term, which takes you right to 2207. I will tell you, as much as we all hate 2207, it is a frequent flyer on both parts of the exam. It's worth taking time to master 2207. And notice that it's not enough just to be able to sort of handle it in multiple choice form. Here's an essay, and not an unusual essay, that requires you to write something intelligent about 2207. So, what are we going to write about it? With 2207, don't start with merchants, because the first part of 2207 has nothing to do with merchants. The first part says, and I put common law mirror image rule in there just so you can refresh your memories. start with 2207, and it says, if we have a definite and seasonable, not reasonable, but seasonable expression of acceptance, then we have a contract, that or a written confirmation. We have a contract. So 2207 subpart 1 forms an agreement. Unless the acceptance is expressly conditioned on assent to the different or additional terms, the language in the acceptance has to mirror that phrase exactly, or it's not expressly conditioned. So it's the exception, not the rule, that an acceptance is expressly conditioned. So step number 1 was a contract form. Do we have a definite and seasonable expression of acceptance or written confirmation? Yes, we do in this case, right? She says, I shall accept, even though it's got the additional term. So then we go to subsection 2, which is what do we do with that additional term? And here it matters whether the parties are merchants. We have one rule when they're not, and a different rule if they are. If they're not merchants, then that additional term is just an offer for an additional term. It can be accepted or rejected by the offeror. But as between merchants, here's a place where we need both parties, offeror and offeree, to be merchants. So you stop now. You already identified Sam as a merchant in the discussion of the firm offer. Now you have to stop for a moment and consider whether Ann is a merchant. Is she a merchant here? Yes, she is, because she also deals in goods of the kind. So as between merchants, what do we do with the additional term? It becomes part of the agreement unless, and there are 3 under the unless. In the disjunctive, which means or, any one of the 3. 2 of the 3 probably won't be the issue. The third one, which we have here, is likely to be the issue. The first one says that if the offer was limited to its terms, rarely the case. Be aware of it, especially for multiple choice purposes, but honestly, it's not usually what's litigated. The third one says, and we'll come back to the second one, I'm leaving it out on purpose at the moment. The third one says, unless the offeror objects within how long, Yasmani? Reasonable time. Don't confuse it with the merchant's exception to the statute of frauds, because there, again, as between merchants, the objection has to come how soon? 10 days. For multiple choice purposes, for MBE purposes, they love to get you tripped up. That 10-day rule is for statute of frauds, the exception, the merchant's exception to the statute of frauds. When it comes to 2207, it's an objection within a reasonable time. Now, third exception is where the litigation lies, which is what we have in this case. If that term is a material alteration, it becomes part of the agreement unless it's a material alteration. And this is a delivery term. How do we know if a term is a material alteration? Well, we're looking for some terms that are familiar from unconscionability. If there's unfair surprise or oppression or hardship, right? But I'm going to tell you the cases fall into 3 groups. Almost all of the cases in respect to material alteration are going to involve an arbitration clause if it's not a custom of the industry, a change in the statute of limitations, or, of course, a disclaimer of implied warranties. That's where you're usually going to see a material alteration. Josh? Yep, I'll repeat the 3. First one I mentioned was an arbitration clause. unless it's the custom of the industry. Obviously, it's not a surprise if it's the custom of the industry. But absent such a custom, arbitration clause, because it can result in unfair hardship. Second, that I mentioned is a change in the statute of limitations, going from the default 4 years under Article 2 perhaps to 1 year. You can't go any lower than 1 year under Article 2. And the third is a disclaimer of warranties, implied warranties. We don't have any of the three in this case. And honestly, I don't know of any case in which a simple delivery, additional delivery term that's fairly innocuous, which is what we have here, has been considered a material alteration. Honestly, though, it doesn't matter so much if you say yes it is or no it is, it's how you get there. So considering whether you have oppression, unfair or undue hardship, or unfair surprise, that would give you a good analysis. Now, the other thing to keep in mind, not tested in this question, is what happens if you have different rather than additional terms. There are three approaches. Maybe you learned the three approaches in your contracts class. Use the knockout rule. That's the one that's the favorite rule. It's probably the one that they've taught you in your commercial courses. So if you have different terms, for example, suppose that the offer says delivery within 15 days and the acceptance says no, delivery within 10 days. Different terms. They're going to knock each other out, which means they're both gone. And if they're gone, what do? We default to what? The code gap fillers. And in this case, the code gap filler would be a reasonable time. So you take something that everybody calls 2207 a murky bit of prose. But if you break it down step by step, guess what? It's not so bad to deal with. You can write a decent essay. All right, so that's our analysis of Anne. Now we go to Beth. Interesting stuff in Beth. Whoever wrote this question either knew contracts really well or did some pretty good research. And I always find it interesting when I read these questions, how much is packed into them. So Beth sends the following fax. And notice, by the way, both Anne and Beth faxed back. The offer was made by a fax. Clearly, in the absence of a stipulation about the method of acceptance, if you use the same acceptance method of acceptance as was used to communicate the offer, there's no problem. It says, Sam, are you kidding? I would never pay that price for number 2 strawberries, signed Beth. So we've got to stop with that sentence. And what do we think it is? A lot of people think it's a rejection. And it might be, but you have to say what's she thinking, because the restatement of contracts quotes language that looks a lot like that and says it may be just a comment on the price. If it's just a comment on the price, it's not a rejection. So I'm telling you, whoever drafted this question was aware of that illustration. Yeah, I know. Exactly right. There is so much packed into these questions. The more you dig, the more you find. So we start first with the question of whether it's a rejection or just a comment on the terms. If it's a rejection, then of course the offer is no longer open, except, got to put a big asterisk by that because of the type of offer we have here. If it's just a comment on the terms, the offer is still open, right? And then, on February 3rd, Beth sends another fax. Sam, I've changed my mind. I will buy 400 pounds of strawberries at at $3 per pound. Now, if she has just commented on the terms when she says, are you kidding? Can she accept at this point? Sure, because she's still within the time period. She has not rejected. If she rejected when she says, are you kidding? What do we see in this fact pattern? What do we know about the offer? It's a firm offer. It said it was going to be held open till the 10th. When did she send back her fax? On the 3rd. Now we turn to the rule for option contracts. We know that, of course, a firm offer is a little bit different from a common law option contract because an option contract has to be supported by consideration, right? But a firm offer does not need consideration, as long as it's in writing, of course, and it's signed by the merchant offeror. But we use a lot of rules associated with option contracts when we analyze a firm offer. And one of those rules has to do with acceptance. Actually, two rules that you want to consider here. First of all, and not raised by this question, but one we always want to keep in mind, of course, we know that acceptance is good on dispatch, right? But if the offer is revoked before the acceptance is dispatched, the revocation is going to prevail. Although revocation, of course, of the offer has to be received to be valid. It's not the fact pattern here. But when you have a firm offer or an option contract, the option/firm offer remains open for the stated period of time. Period. End of story. And so the common law theory goes, if the offeree sends a rejection, the offeree can keep sending communications until the end of the option period. Because you paid under the common law to keep the option open. So when we translate that into a firm offer, even if Beth did reject when she said, "Are you kidding?" she still has the opportunity to accept until the option period is over. And corollary rule number 2, not raised by this fact pattern, is that an acceptance of a firm offer or an option is good not on dispatch, but instead on receipt. Everything here was received within the time period. Remember that. A lot of your analysis of a firm offer, once you get past the basic requirements and once you get past the no consideration rule, it's going to look a lot like an option contract. Yes, sir?
Just to clarify, so a firm offer can't be filled by rejection, but you're saying the common law an option contract can be filled by rejection?
No. It's just it remains open.
Still remains.
It stays open until the option ends, so that if your offeree first rejects, your offeree can turn around and accept later. Think about it for a second. Go back to, Contracts 101. If an offer is made and it's followed by a rejection on the part of the offeree, what happens to the offer? It dies. Not so for a firm offer or an option contract. That's the difference. Yes, sir?
In this particular fact pattern, then would we be able to just say whether or not it was a comment or a revocation is irrelevant because it's a firm offer and under the UCC?
Yeah. You still want to, if you have time, you look at my answer, I go through both. I know, everybody's saying, what time? Yeah, there is no time. But this question, again, whoever wrote this question knew the law and also designed it so you reach the same point, whether it is a comment on the terms or it's a rejection. You end up in the same place. That's a good question because they gave you the chance to go one way or the other and still end up at the same place. I would at least kind of make a distinction between a comment on the terms and a rejection, but then you could say what you just said.
In this fact pattern, would you be able to consider, when choosing between an offer on the price or a rejection, the later comment of the acceptance, which he says, "I changed my mind, I accept"?
Actually, that's a good point that Richard raises, because if it says, "I changed my mind," that is more of an indication that it would be a rejection rather than just a comment on the terms. That's a good point. Use the facts. You end up in the same place, but I kind of like that as a way of approaching the question. Other questions? Okay, let's take a look now. And we're still on acceptance, right? Let's look at Carl. Okay, so Carl, what does Carl say and do? Carl first mails a letter to Sam. Dear Sam, I accept your offer of February 1st, signed Carl. He mails the letter. So what do they want you to talk about there? Well, the mailbox rule, yes, but even before we get to the mailbox rule, the reasonable form of acceptance. And I can't see that there's a problem with it here. But at least I'd mention the issue. Any reasonable method of acceptance is going to be appropriate. And now, of course, we get to the mailbox rule, which we already just discussed. Even though he mailed it, it's received on the 5th, and the option period was until the 10th, so it's timely. But, of course, something else happens before the acceptance is received. So Carl's discussion is pretty simple. Consideration. Don't forget to mention consideration, and something that I'm seeing a lot, it doesn't surprise me because it's kind of a chronic problem. I get a lot of people who talk about consideration on one side but not on the other. When you have a contract that is a bilateral contract, promise for promise, which is what you have here, make sure that you show consideration on both sides. So the seller's promise is consideration to support the buyer's promise, and the buyer's promise is consideration to support the seller's promise. And the other thing to remember, which some of you were writing about, not everybody, but just remember, this is one place where Florida has, we follow a minority rule. We follow the first restatement when it comes to consideration. First restatement says that consideration is either a benefit to the promisor or a detriment to the promisee. It's an or. The second restatement says and. Practically speaking, it makes no difference at all, but show them you know Florida law. And show consideration on both sides, so the discussion here is, of course, and one other comment on that. Whether you're using the first or the second restatement, the case law uniformly looks at the detriment. I had a few people trying to talk about benefit. I can't say it's wrong, but every case looks at detriment. So, Sam's promise to sell the strawberries is a detriment to him. And you're thinking, wait a minute, I said benefit to the promisor. But his promise supports the promise of Ann, Beth, and Carl. And so in respect to the promises made by Ann, Beth, and Carl, he is the promisee, detriment to the promisee because he's saying, I promise to sell. And flip side, the promises made by Ann, Beth, and Carl, supported by Sam's promise. And so you see that he's promised to sell, they promised to buy. Both are detriments. And that's about all you have to say about consideration. So, offer, acceptance, consideration, looks like we've formed a contract. In this question, do we have any defenses to formation? And I want to separate formation from enforcement. Now, the typical kinds of defenses to formation that you're likely to see when it comes to the essay, they love minority. Be on the lookout. And it might not tell you did the cakes and things. How old was Carrie? 17. They told you she was 17. That's a gift. Because there's another question I like to use from time to time where the buyer, seller, it doesn't matter, one of the parties is a high school senior. That's all they tell you. The guy's a high school senior. They want you to talk about capacity. There you have to say, well, he's a high school senior. Maybe he's 17. Maybe he's 18. If he's 17, then. They love capacity. Mistake. They really like mistake. So make sure you know, of course, the difference between mutual mistake and unilateral mistake. I'm not going to go through all the details on them. not relevant to this question, but mistake they love. Sometimes fraud, but I got to tell you, the two that seem to show up the most are mistake and minority. In terms of formation, several people earlier mentioned statute of frauds. That's a defense to enforcement, not formation. And if you want to sound like you really know what you're talking about, you make the distinction. A defense to formation is a defense that says the contract was never formed. I'm a minor. I can avoid the contract because I'm a minor. The contract was never formed. Or we both were mistaken. We thought the cow was barren and it turned out she was fertile. That's a mutual mistake. The contract was never formed. Enforcement, yes, the contract was formed, but it can't be enforced. There's a difference. So we think we have a statute of frauds problem in this case. Josh says yes. Because? It is a sale of goods for $500 or more. Don't make that error either. Because the statute of frauds 2201 says $500 or more. Why does that matter? Because they could easily give you a contract for $500, whether it's essay or multiple choice. So $500 or more. And the contract price here, of course, is more than that's bottom level price. So has the statute of frauds been violated in this case? No. Why not, Josh? Because?
There's sale of goods over 500. It's in writing, signed by.
Okay. Okay. We need, well, signed by the party against whom enforcement is sought, which is Sam in this case, right? So under Article 2, you need a writing. Doesn't have to be pretty, but it has to be a writing. As Josh correctly said, signed by the party against whom enforcement is sought, in this case the seller, which is Sam. And it has to have what in it? Quantity. It's not enforceable beyond the quantity stated. But we've got quantity in these faxes, and Sam signed them, and they're in writing. A fax will and they're never going to adopt revised Article 2 at this point, but revised Article 2 talks about record rather than writing. Even though a fax isn't written out, you know, it's still it's tangible, and so it will satisfy the writing requirement. Yes, Mani?
I mean, she would even mention, because I didn't even think this was an issue in the case.
Oh,
It's not even.
yeah, right. I wouldn't spend much time on it. A couple of people mentioned it, and I have a little bit about it in the answer, but only again because it's a thorough answer. If you don't have time to talk about statute of frauds here, you're really not giving anything up. In a sentence, I would say no statute of frauds problem if you want to be safe, no statute of frauds problem because there's a writing, and I'd be done with it.
Do you recommend us writing it like that? Obviously, it's a small point, but if you put it at the beginning, you know, saying that, okay, there's an offer that satisfies the statute of frauds, or would you rather us put it like defense of
Oh,
contract?
good. It's a good question. I would talk about the statute of frauds at this point in the discussion. Governing law, offer, acceptance, consideration, defenses to formation if they exist, they don't in this case, defenses to enforcement, statute of frauds, we're fine. Because that's logically how it goes. Remember I talked to you about the order, the structure of a contract's answer. Your grader is going to have a grading outline, talked about that a little bit last week, and I can promise you that that grading outline will be structured that way. And particularly for this question, because it's a very well-written question. Sometimes the questions aren't so well written. A little bit later on in some other classes, we're going to see some that aren't so well written. Okay, so contract formed, no defenses. So now we got to move on. And a good contract's answer is going to say, again, governing law, formation, plus defenses. And then we go to the performance/breach phase. Was the contract performed? Was it breached? Is there any excuse from the failure to perform? And then your very last point will be your remedies. And if you structure your contracts question like that, you're going to find your grader going check, 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 check. It's easy to follow. It's the way the grading answer was structured. And you will maximize your points. And that, of course, is your goal. So on February 4th, a freeze destroys Sam's crop. So he can't perform. He says he can't perform. So Sam sends the following fax to Ann, Beth, and Carl. I no longer have number 2 strawberries for sale. Consider my offer of February 1st no longer in effect. Signed, Sam. So what are you supposed to discuss there? Well, the term is, the umbrella term in Article 2 is impracticability. The particular phrase that we need here is impossibility, possibly impracticability. But again, under 2615, it's impracticability. Now, when you discuss, and you wrote Paul Cakes and Things, or whoever they were, there was a strike, and so the issue was raised there. There's a 4-step approach that you can use to make some semblance of order out of chaos. So let me go forward so I get to that 4-step approach. Oh yeah, you know what? I'm sorry. Before we go there, we should stop for a moment because look at the language that Sam said. I no longer have strawberries. Consider my offer of February 1st no longer in effect. But his offer was to be held open until the 10th of February, right? And it's a firm offer, so it's still supposed to be open, and he can't revoke it during that time period. And so he says on February 4th, I'm not going to perform on the 10th. Oh, yeah. Now, do we have prospective inability or anticipatory repudiation? I'm sorry?
I don't understand how you know whether they have it.
Okay, that's what we're going to talk about. That's exactly what we're going to talk about. They are related concepts, prospective inability and anticipatory repudiation. In both instances, we're looking at a contract that is executory, which means there's something left to do. If a party has already performed, and then the other party says, well, I'm not going to perform on the due date, you have to wait till the due date to sue because you're not going to be put out in any other way if you have to wait till the due date. But if you haven't performed yet, you have to make some serious decisions. So for both of these, prospective inability and anticipatory repudiation, the contract has to be executory. For prospective inability, it has to be executory at least as to the non-breaching party. They're very related, and it has to do really, for your, from your perspective, for the need to request reasonable assurances. Now, in real life, it's always a good idea to ask for those assurances because if you don't and you guessed wrong, you're the breaching party. What we need for prospective inability, again, is first of all, a contract that's executory as to the non-breaching party, which would be Ann, Beth, and Carl here. And on the part of the breaching party, some sort of equivocation, a soft, yeah, maybe I won't perform. And if you, and oftentimes, not in this fact pattern, but oftentimes what's going to happen is the non-breaching party finds out that the other party is having financial difficulties or left the country or something like that. Makes you suspect, makes you think, yeah, is that party going to perform? If that's the case, then what you're supposed to do first is demand reasonable assurances. So and of course, under Article 2, your demand for assurances is supposed to be in writing. Common law doesn't require writing, but Article 2 requires that demand in writing. And under Article 2, you have to give the other party 30 days. Common law doesn't have that 30-day period. If the other party, Sam in this case, because Ann, Beth, and Carl would demand the assurances, if that assurance is given, then of course the contract's enforced. But if the assurance isn't given, the reasonable assurance, yeah, I can cover, I can go out there and I can get some more strawberries, or no, I'm not going bankrupt. But if there are no reasonable assurances given, then the non-breaching party can treat the failure to provide assurances as an anticipatory repudiation and go right to the remedies for anticipatory repudiation. So I would, at least in this question, I'd take a brief stop with prospective inability and say, well, maybe, you know, at this point, they should ask for some assurances to cover themselves. But notice, 30 days isn't going to help them a lot, right? And it's an interesting question that is sometimes discussed as to whether that 30-day requirement would be enforced in a contract like this one where time is of the essence. So at least consider it. Now we go to anticipatory repudiation. What do you need for anticipatory repudiation? Either that failure to give adequate assurances if they've been properly demanded, or the following situation: a contract that is executory on both sides. There's something left to do on both sides. And look for that particular fact, particularly in multiple choice questions, because they love to give you a multiple choice question in which one party has already performed. For example, suppose the seller has delivered the goods and the buyer is supposed to pay in 30 days. And then the buyer says, before the 30 days has passed, nope, I'm not going to pay. The seller already delivered the goods. Anticipatory repudiation does not apply. And in the Carrie and Paul and Cakes and Things question that I've read, a lot of people have missed that particular point. So you're just giving away points there. Contract has to be executory on both sides. And then you need the unequivocal, no, I will not perform when the due date comes. I guess that's what Sam said here, close enough for our purposes. If there is that unequivocal, no, I won't perform in respect to an executory contract, then the non-breaching party can proceed to the remedies. I talk about 4. I know a lot of materials say 3. As long as you get the concepts in, doesn't matter exactly how you slice them. But we have, again, 4. You can treat the repudiation as a total breach, a major breach, which will justify suing immediately. And of course, if you're going to sue immediately, you can suspend your performance as well. That's number 1. You can just suspend your performance and wait for the due date. Because maybe you're thinking the breaching party will change his or her mind. And of course, until a remedy is taken by the non-breaching party, the breaching party can revoke the repudiation. 3, treat the repudiation as an offer to rescind. Tear the contract up and walk away. We all go back to square one. Or 4, looks kind of like, why would someone ever want to do it? But it makes sense, actually. Ignore the repudiation and urge the promisor to perform. Why would you do that? If someone just said to you, I'm not performing, why would you say, please, please, please? If you need the goods. So in practice, that happens more than you might think. If you really need the item, then you can try to urge that person to perform. So you have to consider that in this particular case. But beyond the question of whether we do have a repudiation that is actionable, Sam is going to say, I have an excuse. Excuses are different from defenses to formation and defenses to enforcement. Because now we have formed the agreement. We've decided it's enforceable. But now somebody hasn't performed, and the question is he excused? And as I mentioned before, we're talking about impracticability, broad umbrella under Article 2, impossibility, or impracticability. When it comes to that big umbrella, we actually have 3 things, 2 of which are seller's excuses under Article 2, or the person who's supposed to perform if it's the common law, and 1 that belongs to the buyer or the person receiving the services. Impossibility, impracticability, those are excuses for the seller, or under the common law, the party who's supposed to perform. The good news is, when it comes to impossibility, impracticability, frustration of purpose, the rules are the same whether it's Article 2 or common law. So, impossibility, impracticability, in this case for the seller. Frustration of purpose matches up with the buyer or the person receiving the services. All you have to do is remember the coronation case. Everybody covers the coronation case in contracts. The guy that rented a flat on Pall Mall to watch the king's coronation procession, the king got appendicitis, and the owner of the flat tried to sue him for the day rental. And he said, of course he could pay, he could reach into his pocket, but what's the point? My whole purpose in renting the room was to watch the procession, and now it's not taking place. So let us focus on impossibility and impracticability. 4-step process, and some of which tends to fall by the wayside in analysis. Remember always that the first question is, did the parties reallocate the risk of loss? Is there a force majeure clause? Because if they agree on how the risk is going to be spread, that clause will be enforced. So always at least mention the possibility of a contractual reallocation, which of course we don't have in this case. Now, if you do not have a contractual reallocation, then you look for some kind of unforeseen / unforeseeable event that goes to the essence of the contract. Does it matter whether you say unforeseen or unforeseeable? It's one of those few places where I'm not sure. I change my mind every couple of years. Unforeseen, unforeseeable, depends on what source you look at. So it wouldn't matter which term you use there. Something has to happen, an act of God, a strike, a something like that, that interferes with performance, and it can't be foreseen or foreseeable. Now remember good old Plant City, which is kind of in between Tampa and Orlando, inland Florida. And we have a hard freeze in February. Now, we're sitting down here in South Florida, and we're thinking, unforeseeable, a hard freeze. We get a little light freezes, but a hard freeze? Central Florida, apparently, a hard freeze is not unforeseeable. And so all those folks who live or went to school up in that area, they know. So as I say, it's not really a fair question from that perspective. But you know what? It doesn't matter whether you say it is foreseeable or it isn't. It's the methodology that you use to get there. You need to consider whether that event, the hard freeze that destroyed the strawberry crop, should have been foreseeable. So let's change it to South Florida. And we're in June now, but by the time you get to the bar exam, it's going to be July. Hurricane, South Florida, in July, yeah, it might be foreseeable. Maybe not in January. Our hurricane season sometimes goes more than 6 months, but maybe not in January. But in July, yeah. So step number 1, contractual reallocation. If no contractual reallocation, then we look at the event. And if that event is unforeseeable / unforeseen, and again, it's got to go to the essence of the contract, of course, then the question becomes, did it make performance impossible or impracticable? Impossible. It's a trap, and it's something that's tested all the time on the multi-state. Impossibility has to be what kind of impossibility? Objective impossibility. Objective impossibility. And there's a comment 9, don't need the numbers, but comment 9 to 2615 uses farmers as an illustration of this rule. If a farmer contracts to sell, as we have here, 400 pounds of strawberries, and the farmer's crop is destroyed, what's the farmer supposed to do? Go out and find some more strawberries from somebody else. Because just because his crop was destroyed doesn't mean there aren't other strawberry crops out there he could use to fulfill the contract. In this case, it's unlikely that Sam's impossibility, his crop was destroyed, is going to be objective impossibility. It's subjective, but that's not good enough. What should the contract have said to turn his subjective impossibility into objective impossibility? My crop. I sell you, or I offer to sell you 400 pounds of strawberry from my crop. Because then if his crop is destroyed, he can't fulfill the contract with strawberries from somebody else's crop. And that's a frequent flyer on the MBE portion of the exam. So I'm guessing that Sam's performance is not objectively impossible in this case. The question is then, was it impracticable? Impracticability, a close cousin of impossibility, but a little bit different. Because now what you need is performance. And I want to back up for 1 second before I go to impracticability. What do you look for impossibility? Death of the promisor or destruction of the subject matter. And that takes you back to Taylor versus Caldwell, the music hall that burned down, which you probably remember from your contracts class. If the actual subject matter is destroyed, my crop of strawberries, that's classic impossibility. Impossibility, what you need is extreme, lots of X's there, increase in price, number one, for impracticability. And how much is enough? The first restatement said a tenfold increase in price. That particular measure isn't repeated in the second restatement, but you can see a huge increase in price, not just double or maybe even triple. There are a bunch of cases involving the closing of the Suez Canal, I'm sure some of which showed up in your contracts casebook. And the courts very clearly said, you double or triple the price, that's not enough. With Suez Canal closed, you have to go all the way around the Cape of Good Hope, longer trip, but who cares? It might cost you a little more, but who cares? Huge increase in price coupled with risk to person or property. And that's key. It's not just the increase in price. You've got to have some kind of risk to person or property. Impracticability is a really tough defense to make, or excuse, really, to make. There's a case some of you may have had in your contracts class involving refacing of a dam in Alaska. And the party that had promised to reface the dam was trying to carry the rock, the rip rock that they used to reface the dam, across the dammed lake in the wintertime because it was too hard to go around. And they had contractually agreed that they were going to take it across the lake. But every time they tried to go across the lake, what happened? The ice broke and they fell through. And first they just lost trucks, but then they lost people. It's a rare case where the court did find impracticability. Court said it came really close to, but wasn't quite impossibility. It's impracticability because people were getting killed.
So does that apply even if the original job is involving risk?
Well, yeah, that was risky to begin with. But what it shows you is how hard it is to show impracticability. And it's a rare case, the court said, extreme cost plus risk to person or property. Court didn't address a case like this where there's no risk to begin with, but it's suggesting that in a case like this, impracticability is going to be almost impossible to prove, right?
Mortgage that needs to be paid by a farmer risk constitute a risk to the property?
Oh, possibly. Kevin's question was, could a mortgage, if you don't pay your mortgage, you're going to lose your farm in foreclosure? Interesting question, and you might be able to work with that. I've never seen a case that quite addresses it, but you could get creative. And if there is that huge increase in price plus the risk of losing your livelihood, your farm, maybe. Yeah, maybe. So 3 steps so far. Contractual reallocation, no. Then is there that unforeseen, unforeseeable event that goes to the essence of the contract? If yes, then did it make performance impossible or impracticable? 4th point, which usually gets left out, but it's actually an important point and a very logical point, which is the event, whatever it is, was it the fault of the party who's seeking excuse? Because if you cause the problem, then you can't hide behind it. And let's take Sam. It's a hard freeze. He really didn't have control over that, probably. But suppose he just forgot to water his crop for a couple of weeks. And remember, we're talking about the winter months in Florida, so you can't just rely on rain. We do actually have a dry season, short as it is. So if it's his fault that his crop is destroyed, he cannot claim impossibility or impracticability. Now, if he has breached, Sam, and if he has no excuse for the breach, then, of course, the last question is remedy. Once again, that nice art. Contracts, a lot of rules to learn. You got 2 sets of rules, but it writes itself if you keep the order in mind. So we talk about remedies. And we're talking about the buyers here.
Damages and remedies is the same thing.
Well, remedies is the broader term. Damages, money damages, specific performance, equitable remedy, right? So the broad category again is remedies, money damages, specific performance. Question?
Sorry, you were talking about like cover and specific performance when it says do not.
Yeah, no. Okay, and the call of the question here says don't talk about it. I include it so that we can discuss it. But absolutely, and thank you for pointing that out. If they tell you not to discuss something, don't discuss it, right? So I apologize for that. When I write these answers, folks, I include stuff because a lot of people use these handouts as study guides. So understand again that I have more in my answers than you would have. It's not a stupid question at all. Answer the question. You won't get points for talking about stuff that's not in the call of the question. But I want to take a moment before we take a break to review remedies, but not a stupid question at all. So, cover, hypothetical cover. Under Article 2, you have buyer remedies, you have seller remedies. Know them because they're tested a lot on the MBE, and sometimes they're tested in Florida too. The seller resells, the buyer covers, right? And while cover is, and notice, see, I've got specific performance. While cover is the preferred remedy for the buyer is not required to cover. So a lot of people saying that the buyer must mitigate. Not true under Article 2. Remedies are cumulative under Article 2. The non-breaching party gets to pick and choose. Mitigation becomes important sometimes in the common law, and it is important under Article 2 when it comes to consequential damages. You always have to mitigate in respect to consequential damages. But basic measure, mitigation really isn't required. The buyer may cover, may go out and buy strawberries on the market. The buyer doesn't have to. So your cover, and when we talk about Article 2 remedies, or money damage remedies, you're going to have a formula. So if you're struggling to remember them, it's going to be the difference between something and something. That's your basic measure. I'm going to tell you what the something and something is, okay? But it's a formula. Difference between something and something. Plus something, and then less something. I know. We're going to fill in the blanks now. So the difference between something and something. If the buyer chooses to cover, and then the buyer can get the difference between the contract price and the cover price. That's the something and the something, right? And of course, the buyer is going to want that measure if the cover price is more than the contract price, if the market has risen. plus something. What's the something? Plus incidental damages, and for buyers, consequential damages if they are foreseeable, Hadley versus Baxendale, unavoidable, that's your mitigation, which is relevant to consequential damages, and ascertainable. You can put a dollar figure on them. So, basic measure, difference between contract price and cover price, plus incidental damages, damages that flow directly from the breach. You have to make some phone calls, you have to send out some letters to try to find a cover, plus consequential damages for the buyer, foreseeable, ascertainable, and unavoidable, less expenses saved. So if, for example, our buyer had a warehouse that was set up, or a warehouse rental that had been set up, and the buyer is able to get out of the warehouse rental because the strawberries never came, that's an expense saved. That's cover, hypothetical cover, difference between contract price and market price at the time the buyer learns of the breach. For MBE purposes, that becomes real important. Plus incidental and consequential damages, less expenses saved. And when can a buyer get specific performance under Article 2? If the goods are unique or in other proper circumstances. Unique goods, that's easy to see, but a little hint, easy to test. Other proper circumstances, most of the time the case law involves outputs or requirements contracts. So look for specific performance in the context, again, of an outputs or a requirements contract. Okay, any questions about this question? Yes, sir.
Earlier when you were talking about anticipatory repudiation, you mentioned that time is of the essence here.
Oh, it's not, I shouldn't have used that phrase because that's a technical phrase. In this case, of course, the contract was going to expire in a couple of days. But time as of the essence is a term of art that says that specifically states a date. So I probably shouldn't have used that phrase. Time was not of the essence in this case, in that technical sense. Yes, sir.
When you say the contract's going to expire in a few days, that's when you throw me off.
Well, the offer was set to expire.
Okay.
That's,
But it doesn't mean
yeah, the offer. Okay, other questions? We'll take about a 10-minute break. When we come back, I'll do the drawing, and then we'll do the torts question. Now, one thing before we jump into torts, a couple of things before we jump into torts. A lot of people have been asking me, in terms of essay questions on the break, but what's the right answer? I hope you're beginning to understand that when it comes to the essay, for the most part, it's how you argue your case, right? It's not the yes or the no, it's how you get there, which is what exams are all about. However, do understand that if there is a specific Florida rule that applies, there may be a yes or a no. So you do need to understand and apply Florida rules. So just keep that in mind. Now, in respect to torts, I know, and it's impossible for me, unfortunately, to track exactly along with your course because you're all doing different courses, and even if you're doing the same course in different locations, you're doing the topics in different order. So I apologize for that. I can't do anything about it. Some of you haven't studied torts yet, but I can tell you that the question that I picked, which is going to deal with products liability, is a subject that a lot of people didn't get very much of in torts class, right? Depends on who taught you torts, but your torts professors oftentimes don't get there. And I find, especially in the last couple of years, I've found that our students kind of fuzzy on products liability. It is something you have to know for the MBE portion of the exam, number one. And number two, in terms of torts essays, and remember, I think you're going to get a torts essay, it's kind of overdue. They haven't tested products liability in a while. So it's another reason why I picked that question. Before we jump into it, one final comment. I think I mentioned it last week. I'm kind of still struggling with this particular point. A couple of months ago, the Florida Supreme Court struck down on equal protection grounds using, surprisingly, the lowest level of scrutiny, rational relationship, the cap on non-economic damages in med-mal cases. So really, I've read the opinion a couple of times and kind of surprised. But anyway, there it is. And do they like to give med-mal questions on the essay portion of the exam? You bet. To complicate matters more, there is a case in front of the Florida Supreme Court right now dealing with that same provision as applied, retroactively. And I don't know enough about that case to even predict what the Supreme Court's going to do or when they're going to come out with their opinion. So what do you do should you get a med-mal case question on the exam? Well, multiple choice questions, they're drafted, they're tested, they're stuck with them. Essays, even if it's drafted in respect to the law as it stood at the time of drafting, all they have to do is change the answer. So you do need to be aware of changes in the law. I think I mentioned before, and I was talking to Amar, and he was the class that had it happen. On July 1st of, I think it was 2008, a new statute took effect, abolishing joint and several liability in Florida. On July 27th, whatever it was, when they sat down for the Florida portion of their exam, they got a question dealing with joint and several liability. They can and they do test recent changes in Florida law when it comes to the essays. If anybody tells you otherwise, then they're not paying attention to what's going on. MBE, they're going to tell you there's a lag time, and that's probably true. And maybe even Florida multiple choice. But when it comes to the essays, all they have to do is tweak the answer a little bit, and you've got to change. So what would I do if I got a med-mal question? I'd still have some familiarity with those caps, which are horrendous, the detail that's involved in those caps. But some familiarity, and then I'd say, oh, and by the way, the Florida Supreme Court has declared the cap on non-economic damages to be unconstitutional under it was an equal protection analysis that they used. And then hope that that's all you need to say. All right, so let's take a look now at the fact pattern for the tort question. And same thing, take a few moments to read it, and then we're going to break it apart.
mine.
I threw a lucky shot. At you.
Okay, so let's see what we have in our torts question. It's a products liability question. And the question, but I took it upstairs. Okay, I was going to read, somebody, is there an extra one out there anywhere so I can read? Yeah, I'll give it back. Just want to be able to read the question. It's a short fact pattern to the point, but there's a ton that's packed in it. And that's going to be typical of the kind of question that you're going to get. Including, if we jump to the call of the question for a moment, it writes certain things out of the call of the question. Don't talk about the Jones Act. Don't talk about maritime law. Going back to the discussion we had previously, if the question says don't talk about something, then don't talk about it. And you're all going, what is the Jones Act and what is maritime law, right? Yeah. Not to worry. Okay, there's enough that you do need to know, right? So we've got John, boat owner. He owns a boat. And to prevent fires in his cabin cruiser, he buys an automatic exhaust fan from Marina to remove gasoline vapors from the cruiser's engine compartment. Well, now we know we've got a product, and you know what's going to happen. Something's going to blow up, somebody's going to get injured, right? And of course, boat owner is going to be our purchaser. Marina is going to be our retailer, because we're going to end up with some additions that I put in there, again, for discussion purposes more than anything else, with a chain of distribution. Our manufacturer, possibly a wholesaler, then the retailer, and then the purchaser, and that's your vertical chain. Then on the horizontal plane, customer who's going to end up being injured. Unknown to boat owner or marina, the fan contained a defect. You see that word defect, and right away you know you need to talk about products liability. Products liability is the umbrella phrase. It's the thing that covers various causes of action. Maybe strict products liability, it may be negligence products liability, it may be warranty products liability, it could even be fraud-based products liability. Do we have anybody who took a products liability class? Maybe a few, no? A couple, yeah. In some jurisdictions, you got to pick one cause of action and go with it. In Florida, we allow pleading in the alternative. So when you write your answer, you're going to go through all the possible causes of action in Florida. So this is the kind of question, wow, it would take me a lot more than an hour to write it. How are we going to cut some corners and get everything done in an hour? That's part of what we're going to talk about. So we have a defect that produced sparks when the fan was turned on by an automatic timing device. Such defects occur occasionally in the normal manufacturing process and can be discovered by quality control. If they occur occasionally in the normal manufacturing process, what kind of defect do we have? Manufacturing defect. And what you're going to want to do as much as possible, there are some nice categories and a nice framework that's created by the third restatement of torts in respect to products liability. I recommend you use this approach. You can use the 402A approach, but it's very wordy and it's hard to break apart. Use these elements and use a short form for products liability, which I'll talk about in a moment. It makes the answer a little more manageable. So we've got a manufacturing defect. That's the good news, because the rules for design defects and warning defects are a lot more difficult and, quite frankly, a lot mushier. But manufacturing defect, easy to spot and relatively easy to deal with. Design defect, remember, everything in the line is defective. A manufacturing defect, one or two or a few in the line are defective. Defects do not become apparent to the consumer until the fan is used for several months, so of course we have a latent defect. Boat owner invited customer. What do you see right there? Boat owner invited customer. What should you be thinking about? Premises liability. Yeah, interesting part of the question. One of the reasons I kind of like it. Premises liability usually involves land. We've got a boat here. And there are actually cases involving cruise lines in which premises liability is invoked. This is a smaller boat, But I have to tell you, whoever wrote the question was clearly looking for a premises liability discussion. And we have very specific rules about premises liability in Florida, which the examiners love to test. Very frequent flyer. So make sure you review the Florida rules, both common law and statutory, for premises liability, because it's a good chance, if there's a tort question, that you need to know them. So customer is invited to go fishing, and so he starts out as an invitee, right? But then you know customer is going to do something stupid. While drifting within the Florida territorial limits, to show that, yeah, jurisdiction, Florida law applies. Customer who was interested in engines checked out the cruiser's engine. And you'll see in my discussion, I'm kind of assuming that he goes to a kind of identified area in the boat. Because an engine, it could be if it's a little boat just sitting out on the deck, but chances are good if it's a bigger boat, which we have here, it's in an isolated place. I'm using that as a way to talk about the difference between an invitee and a trespasser, because they clearly wanted you to discuss it. Oh yeah, oh yeah. While tinkering with the engine, customer accidentally spilled some fuel from the carburetor, stupid, on the equipment. The exhaust fan goes on, of course, a spark ignites, and it spills the fuel. Customer is badly burned. Now, while tinkering with the engine, he is, what phrase?
Negligent?
Negligent. He's comparatively negligent, right? And if you haven't learned it already, Florida is a pure comparative negligence jurisdiction. Important. Got to know your Florida laws. He's badly burned, which shows what kind of an injury? Injury to the person, right? He's got to be injured to the person or to property. You can couple economic damages with it, but you don't want to start with economic damages. Now, it is an older question. You can see by the date on it. And so it's got a very broad call of the question, discuss the causes of action available, and defenses. The questions today tend to be a little more directed. But if you get an open-ended question like this, and you could with torts, think back to especially your first semester, first year torts exam, you're going to have all sorts of causes of action, multiple plaintiffs, multiple defendants. You have just one plaintiff here, but you could have multiple everything. Now, what do you do then? How do you organize a question like this? There are several different ways to do it, any one of which could be correct. And while I can tell you exactly what the grader is going to be looking, well, not exactly, but pretty close to what the grader is going to be looking at in contracts, because there's always one way to write about contracts, I can't promise you which way the person who wrote the grading answer is going to slice a question like this. You'll see how I did it. It worked for me. You're looking for an efficient way to write your answer, because there's so much going on in this question, and you have just an hour, and you're trying to avoid inefficiency as much as possible. So what I have done is group by cause of action, and then, of course, defenses. And what's left of joint tortfeasor liability in Florida. Could you group by defendant? Sure. Could you do each cause of action, each defendant separately? Yeah, but then that's going to take a long time. So I group for efficiency's sake. And notice, I start with strict liability, then I go to negligence, and then I go to breach of warranty. That is a typical approach. It isn't the only approach, but it is a typical approach. And when you are analyzing an MBE question that deals with products liability, I think in this order. And let me explain why. Strict liability is usually the easiest of the theories to prove. Why? Because the plaintiff doesn't have to prove fault. Strict liability. Negligence is usually the second strongest, easiest to prove. Why? You have to prove fault, but you don't have to prove any kind of privity, which you may still need for warranty. And Florida has some kind of funky rules on warranty. So I would, again, I would present them in that order, going from strongest down, And I certainly would keep that pecking order in mind for MBE purposes. All right, now you will also see that I threw in manufacturer. They don't actually give you a manufacturer in the fact pattern. I wouldn't make one up if you're writing your answer. I put manufacturer in there so that we can do a more extended discussion of the topic. So, strict liability, it's torts. Elements, elements, elements. Here, I don't care who you had for torts, elements, elements, elements. Know the elements of your prima facie case and be able to spit them out. And then your affirmative defenses, of course. Strict liability. I'm going to suggest a short form approach, which once again, based primarily in the third restatement, but it makes the answer easier to write, I think, than 402A. Is 402A wrong? Absolutely not, and 402A comes from a Florida case. But in terms of presentation, a lot of cases are following this approach now, and it is manageable. We look for a strict duty, a breach of that strict duty, causation and damages. Easy to remember, right? And easier to write about than 402A. So strict duty, breach of the strict duty, causation, damages. Looks a lot like negligence. The difference, of course, is the strict duty. Who owes the strict duty? Because you're going to ask yourself who owes the duty and to whom is the duty owed. Guess what? That's Cardozo's foreseeable plaintiff. So who owes the duty? You have to be a what? You have to be a seller or a distributor of products. And you'll see, you know, I have a lot of citations to the third restatement. You don't need the citations, but you can see how much I'm drawing from the third restatement because it works. So we need that seller or distributor of products, and of course, manufacturer, who isn't technically a party here, but helps us in the picture. Manufacturer is certainly somebody who sells fans, and then Marina also sells fans commercially. So both manufacturer and Marina would owe that duty. Now we ask, to whom is the duty owed? You'll notice in any torts answer that I do, and when I teach torts, I teach it this way. I put the foreseeable plaintiff with duty. Why do I do that? Because I'm listening to Cardozo. Remember poor Mrs. Palsgraf. He said she was not a foreseeable plaintiff, so she loses. He created the foreseeable plaintiff to create a question of law, not fact, because he didn't want the jury to be sympathetic to Mrs. Palsgraf. Who decides duty? Who determines the duty? Very important for both essay and multiple choice. The judge determines duty. Who decides causation? The jury does. Look at the difference. Cardozo didn't want the jury to be sympathetic to Mrs. Palsgraf, so he created the foreseeable plaintiff to whom the duty is owed, and he took the issue away from the jury. So I think, and not just me, a lot of people think, foreseeable plaintiff should be discussed in the context of duty. And we ask here, to whom is that strict duty owed? It's owed to the user or consumer or a foreseeable bystander. And of course, the question may become here, is customer a foreseeable bystander? And I'd say yes. You know, in answer to a lot of those questions that we're asking, if you decide that customer isn't a foreseeable plaintiff, well, it's not the yes or the no, it's how you get there, right? But he's been invited onto the boat, and you've got a defective product on the boat, so I think he's a foreseeable bystander. Now, how do you, and of course your duty is to produce, your strict duty is to produce a product without a defect. How do you breach that strict duty? By producing, guess what? A defective product. Because a breach always involves not doing something you're supposed to do or doing something you're not supposed to do. So if you produce a defective product, you've breached the strict duty. And as I mentioned before, we have 3 kinds of defects: manufacturing, design, and warning. This case involves a manufacturing defect, which makes it easier because, again, the rules are much more difficult for design defect and warning defect. So I quickly show that we have a manufacturing defect. Strict duty, breach of the duty, causation. For products liability, you go through the same 2 steps that you would go through for negligence. You have to prove cause and fact first, and then proximate cause. And proximate cause is, at least some cases say, even more important in strict liability than it is in negligence because you're imposing duty without fault. So we're looking a little more carefully. What about cause in fact? What test should we use? But for. You use the but for test if you have just one cause in any kind of negligence or strict liability, only one cause, or if you have multiple causes, none of which acting alone would have caused the entire harm, which is going to be your usual case. We've got the defective fan. We've got the customer who spills the fuel. If the customer spills the fuel and the fan's not defective, no fire. If the fan's defective but customer doesn't spill the fuel and cause the fumes, no fire. So but for is the appropriate test here. That part's probably easy. Then what do? We go to proximate cause. Now, there are different tests for proximate cause out there. You're going to be fine if you use the one that you probably learned in your torts class, which is the foreseeability of the harm. And make sure you say it right, though. It's the foreseeability of the harm. And same thing, of course, for negligence. So was the harm suffered by customer foreseeable? What do we think? Yeah, probably. If you've got a defective fan that can spark and cause a fire and somebody gets burned, yeah, it's foreseeable. Of course, you're thinking there's a what? Or you should be thinking. Superseding. There is an intervening cause, right? Because the fan was defectively constructed first, manufactured, and then customer spills the fuel. So we need to talk about whether the intervening cause is superseding. If it's just intervening, liability is not cut off. If it's superseding, liability is cut off. Notice where I discuss intervening and superseding causes in respect to the case itself, to the prima facie case. A lot of people talk about it as a defense. It's not a true affirmative defense because it negates one of the elements. What would be a true affirmative defense? Comparative negligence. All of the elements are in place, but oops, the plaintiff was negligent too. So it is appropriate to discuss intervening and superseding intervening causes in the context of the prima facie case. Clearly, we have an intervening cause in this case, the spilling of the fuel by customer. What do we think? Superseding or not? Marla shakes her head. Why do you say no? There's no right or wrong answer here. I kind of agree. Why not?
Because it doesn't cut off their.
Well, it's not going to cut off if it's not superseding. Why do we think it's not superseding in this case? Ben?
It's foreseeable that somebody has gas inside an engine.
Okay, it's foreseeable that there's gas in an engine, and it's also foreseeable, if you've been on a boat, especially if you're out on the water, the boat's going to be going along, you might hit a wave, and fuel could get spilled, right? So yeah, I kind of think it's foreseeable. But if you said, no, it's not foreseeable, it's not the answer, it's how you get there. Now, finally, harm to person or property. And know a little bit about this particular point for discussions of Florida law. In Florida, we're going to distinguish between economic and non-economic damages. I just mentioned the med mal caps. So know the difference. And your economic damages, of course, those are your hard costs, the ones that you can quantify, medical bills, lost wages, hospital bills, things like that. Your non-economic damages, which is what the Supreme Court has been addressing recently, those are your soft costs that don't have a clear monetary amount, pain and suffering, loss of consortium. And a little discussion of those things, even though you can't be too specific in this case, definitely worthwhile. So notice what we've done. We've made a prima facie case. And now we need to discuss defenses. Your obvious defense is going to be comparative negligence. So what you have to do, and we'll go past this part here. Punitive damages. Everybody always wants to talk about punitive damages. I wouldn't spend a lot of time on it here because it's really not raised by the facts. Oftentimes, though, the question does involve punitive damages. So just one more time, a place where Florida law is very specific. We have different categories for punitive damages. Make sure you review them because they do like to test them. Now, collateral source, I put in there just as a study tool. We do have a fairly detailed collateral source rule in Florida. I've never seen them test it in great detail. I would throw a sentence in to say, of course, if the damage is covered by an appropriate collateral source, you can't have a recovery in tort as well. You can't have double recovery. It's as much as I would say. Now, pure comparative negligence, make sure you say Florida is a pure comparative negligence jurisdiction. And don't say Florida is a pure comparative fault jurisdiction. It's a pure comparative negligence jurisdiction. There are some terms that people confuse a lot. They're different, they mean different things, and they both get tested a lot. If you are talking about plaintiff versus defendant, comparative negligence. If you are talking about defendant versus defendant, multiple tortfeasors, it's relative fault. Once again, comparative negligence, plaintiff versus defendant, defendant versus defendant, multiple joint tortfeasors, relative fault. And we'll come back to that point in a moment. So, Florida's pure comparative negligence, we all know what pure comparative negligence is, right? Plaintiff can recover even if the plaintiff is, choose your percentage, 99%, 99.9%, whatever you like to say, negligent. And was our customer somewhat negligent in this case? Yeah. They're never going to make you calculate. That's the good news. So just say plaintiff's recovery will be reduced by plaintiff's percentage of fault, and you're done. Let me mention assumption of the risk, even though in this case it actually is not a major issue. In Florida, we do recognize express assumption of the risk. But express assumption of the risk is very limited. You have to actually sign that waiver. When you go to the go-kart track and before you get into the go-kart, they make you sign away your life. That's what you need for express assumption of the risk in Florida. If we're talking about implied assumption of the risk, which is almost always the case, did customer impliedly assume the risk, voluntarily walk into a place where there might be a risk, then in Florida, implied assumption of the risk is viewed as just another form of comparative negligence. So it's not a separate defense, it's a form of comparative negligence. Again, show you know Florida law. I have a lot more detail on assumption of the risk there. Take a look at it because it's relevant primarily for your MBE. I'm not going to spend time on it now unless we have questions. All right, so now we go to negligence. And guess what? We've kind of laid the groundwork, and we can start to speed up, which is the good news. Because for negligence, I put in parentheses boat owner's employer. A lot of people ask about boat owner's employer. There isn't an employer in the case. I wouldn't make one up for exam purposes, but people ask about it because they do like to test vicarious liability. So always be on the lookout for it. But negligence primarily against boat owner, maybe manufacturer, who again, I made up for our purposes, and definitely marina. And you can plead in the alternative in Florida, so you can have a strict liability cause of action and a negligence liability cause of action. They're very similar, except in respect to the duty, and really just in respect to the duty. So, what's our basic duty? Of course, the basic duty is to use, this time, reasonable care in manufacturing the product. Now, we see a little difference from strict liability. Strict liability, it's a strict duty in which you cannot produce a defective product. Now we've got to use reasonable care in manufacturing the product. For boat owner, it would be reasonable care in securing the deck of the boat or whatever portions of the boat the customer could walk into. Foreseeable plaintiff, again, same analysis that we had before. And what you can do, if you like, when you get to the places where the analysis is identical to the analysis that you previously had, you can say, see above. You're allowed to do that. Of course, if you're using ExamSoft, you can cut and paste if you like, whichever. If you're handwriting, see above. Now, breach, of course, same as before. Notice, however, that I took two alternatives when it came to boat owner. A typical negligence analysis, and then I took a premises liability approach. Why? Because there's no way that they wrote this question without wanting you to talk about premises liability, because customer starts out in one place and then wanders into another. That's such a classic premises liability question. So, in Florida, we speak of invited licensees. That's a common, actually from a case, that's a common law concept in Florida. The invited licensee is a combination of invitee and licensee in Florida. And the duty that is owed to the invited licensee is the duty that's owed to an invitee at common law, the twofold duty. Number one, to inspect, and number two, to warn or make safe. And we started out in Florida with two categories, invited licensee and uninvited licensee, which would include your various levels of trespassers. And customer starts out as an invitee, but then customer wanders away someplace to where the engine is. At that point in time, customer is probably not an invitee anymore. Customer is a trespasser. Now, in Florida, past that, we call them not known or unknown trespassers, which is the common law phrase, discovered or undiscovered trespasser. And they love to test this stuff. It's tested over and over again. So make sure that you have this vocabulary. So, undiscovered trespasser, that's somebody that isn't discovered within 24 hours of the incident, which isn't likely in this case, because they found customer pretty quickly when customer got burned. But if you've got, this big tract of land and somebody wanders onto it and gets injured and 5 days later they find him, that's an undiscovered trespasser. What's the duty that's owed to the undiscovered trespasser? It's a very limited duty, because all the owner has to refrain from is intentional misconduct, which clearly didn't occur in this case. So, boat owner couldn't toss the match at customer in this case. Intentional conduct. If, on the other hand, we have a discovered trespasser, the rule is a little broader. Who's a discovered trespasser? That's somebody you do find within 24 hours of the event, which is probably customer in this case. Now, what's our duty? Notice now that it is a little broader, because it's a duty to refrain from gross negligence or intentional misconduct. So we broaden the intentional misconduct rule that is relevant to the undiscovered trespasser, and we include gross negligence, whatever that means. It's a higher standard than ordinary negligence, obviously. But notice also that the duty is in respect to conditions that are known to the owner but not to the trespasser. Same distinction, of course, that you would have in common law. That typical example would be the hole that's covered over with moss or something like that, that you don't see but that the landowner knows is there because he had a tree, pulled up the stump, left the hole, and it kind of grew over. So, once again, your standard for your discovered trespasser. Now, causation, we talked about it already. It's identical. Damages, we talked about it already. It's identical. See how you can be efficient in your answer. Defenses, done with it. There are some very specific defenses, by the way, to premises liability. For example, dealing with people who are intoxicated. Not relevant here, so I didn't include them. But once again, review those rules for premises liability. They love to test them. So I'm going to skip past negligence now, where you would repeat the process if you were discussing manufacturer. With Marina, though, we need to spend a moment. Because Marina didn't make the fan. Marina just sold the fan. Remember, of course, that Marina is in the chain of distribution, and so as a member of the chain of distribution, Marina could be held strictly liable, even if Marina didn't make the fan, even if Marina didn't know that the fan had a defect. When it comes to negligence, however, now Marina has to do something that's negligent, which in this case would, if anything, be inspection of the fan. But honestly, maybe while that duty existed, it's likely that Marina didn't breach that duty. Why? What did they tell you about the defect? You couldn't tell. It took some time to manifest. That fact is there clearly to help Marina out here. And as you read these facts, really pick them apart and say, what's this fact doing here? And when they tell you that the defect can't manifest itself for a while, then we know they're telling you, Marina, even if Marina had a duty to inspect, Marina didn't breach the duty. They're giving you signals, they're telling you what you want to write about. Same thing though, of course, we go through the elements of the prima facie case and the defenses. See above, good enough. Or cut and paste, whichever you like. Now, breach of warranty. Don't forget about breach of warranty in the context of products liability. And we've got express warranties, we've got implied warranties. Express warranty, an affirmation of fact that becomes part of the basis of the bargain. Was there an express warranty in this case that was breached? Probably not. Some express warranties must have been made. They described the fan or put some kind of labels on it, but nothing in the facts that we have. And so there isn't much that we have to work with here. And honestly, if I were writing my answer and I'm getting toward the end of the hour, I might not even discuss express warranty. I'd go to the implied warranties because they could be relevant. Now, remember I mentioned privity. I'm not going to go into it in detail here. We do have some kind of funky privity rules in Florida. Take a look at what I've written here. And the idea is that if you've got your privity, if you can recover based on privity in an express warranty, then maybe you don't also get the option of suing for strict liability. But that's only if privity has been satisfied. Unlikely, honestly, that they're going to test it, but you can always, if you see it in the facts, you can talk about it. Now, implied warranty, we've got two kinds of implied warranties. Implied warranty of merchantability and implied warranty of fitness for a particular purpose. Merchantability, the seller must be a merchant who deals in goods of the kind. And clearly, marina and manufacturer, if we had manufacturer, would be someone who deals in goods of the kind. And, whoops, sorry. Was the fan fit for its ordinary purpose? No, because it sparked and it caught on fire. Fitness for a particular purpose probably isn't raised by these facts, right? Because for an implied warranty of fitness for a particular purpose, the buyer has to make known to the seller the buyer's particular purpose. We have nothing in the facts to support a communication of that kind of knowledge. So once again, especially if I'm running out of time, probably wouldn't even talk about fitness for a particular purpose.
So, fitness for a particular purpose, I kind of understood it differently, but I just thought that usually would arise in a case where it's just like, I'm doing this particular, you do communicate that to the seller, but it's just something of maybe of a products of general use, or it's not usually used for that.
Yes, but the first thing is the buyer has to tell the seller. And the best example is one of the examples from the comments to 2315, which creates the implied warranty of fitness for a particular purpose. And you'll probably remember it from your contracts class or from someplace. The example is somebody who walks into, suppose you go to Macy's. And you probably wouldn't go to Macy's for specific kind of climbing boots, but the example involves climbing boots. So you go to Macy's and you say, I want climbing boots because I'm going climbing in the Canadian Rockies. And you're being very specific and you're saying what your particular purpose is. And Macy's, they sell shoes, right? But they don't deal specifically in climbing boots. So there you have a particular purpose. If, on the other hand, you go to Timberland or some of these other places, outfitter stores, Urban Outfitter, not Urban Outfitter, but what's the one that's up on 95? The Outdoor World, thank you. Exactly, you go to Outdoor World and you say, I want some hiking boots. Well, they deal with hiking boots, and so there it's probably the ordinary purpose, right? But once again, you start with the premise that the particular purpose has to be communicated directly to the seller. And then also the buyer has to rely on the seller's skill or judgment, and the seller has to know the buyer's relying. In this case, the facts aren't there. One final comment, the defenses are going to be the same. That's what's interesting. So even though it looks like it's a contract-based cause of action in the context of products liability, you're going to still consider comparative negligence. So I've summarized my causes of action, but then I have one last thing. Don't forget about the one last thing, which is our joint tortfeasors. A few years ago, you'd look at joint tortfeasors and you would just die because the rules were so complicated and just honestly didn't make a whole lot of sense. As I mentioned before, 2008, we abolished joint and several liability in most cases in Florida. So the good news now is that liability is based on, as I said before, relative fault, and use the right vocabulary. The more that you use the specific right terms, the more points you get. Real simple. Relative fault. And then we no longer really need to talk about contribution in Florida, but we still might need to talk about indemnification. So, joint and several liability has been abolished in Florida. Liability is based on relative fault, the percentage of fault that is attributable to any one defendant. That's the most that that defendant can be required to pay. Indemnification, however, occurs or can occur when one tortfeasor is found liable based solely on his or her or its relationship to another tortfeasor. And that's our retailer in this example. Question, Josh?
Yeah. It's about the fact that, say, such injuries occur occasionally in the normal manufacturing process. What's enough that it's foreseeable? Like, is 1 in a million
Oh.
foreseeable
Um,
for strict liability?
Well, if it's different, there's a different issue I think you're actually asking. It's not a question of foreseeability so much as when do you cross the line from a manufacturing defect to a design defect? And it's a manufacturing defect if you have just an occasional blip, whatever occasional is. It's a design defect if all of them or most of them are defective. And it's a question of fact when you cross that line. The good news is it's unlikely that you're going to have to wrestle with that particular point. They're going to say, as they did in this question, 1 or 2, or they're going to say all. That's the good news. Now, back to indemnification, though. It's an important point. It is something you should include in your essay if you have multiple tortfeasors. So, in this case, we have retailer who could be held strictly liable. Retailer is strictly liable solely because retailer is in the chain of distribution. But who created the defect? Manufacturer did. And if, as is the case here, retailer is passively negligent, or excuse me, passively liable just by the relationship, then retailer can pass, and retailer is sued, and recovery is had against retailer, retailer can pass the entire amount back to the actively, I don't want to say negligent, but the active party, which is the manufacturer. So for indemnification, the entire loss can be passed back to the person who caused the problem in the first place. That's different from contribution, which we really don't need anymore in Florida. In contribution, if one joint tortfeasor paid more than his share, as with joint and several liability, you know, for MBE purposes, if you have multiple tortfeasors and they're jointly and severally liable, one tortfeasor can be sued for the entire amount. Then that tortfeasor would seek contribution from fellow tortfeasors to even out so that they end up paying only their percentage. But with indemnification, you pass the entire amount back to the person who actually caused the problem. Where are you likely to see indemnification? Products liability, going up the chain of distribution, or employer-employee, when you're talking about vicarious liability. An employer is likely to be sued, right? Because the employer's the deep pocket. But the employer, if all the employer did was employ the employee, there's no negligence on the part of the employer, then the loss can be passed entirely to the employee. Okay, that's a lot of stuff, I know. But it's the kind of stuff that you need to know, both the products liability for MBE and the Florida-specific stuff for Florida. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to stick around. Next week, as you pick up and leave, next week, Professor Martin's going to talk about Articles 3 and 9. I would urge you to come because probably you're going to get one of them on the exam. You're welcome.